And now podcasting from the great state of Alaska, this is the Upper One Podcast.
Hey y'all, welcome back to this episode of the Upper One Podcast. This is Scott again, high in the Eagle River Valley. Not as far up as the other podcast I listened to, but high up in the Eagle River Valley. So on this episode, what I wanted to do was just get another one out there. I got a couple ideas where what I'm doing is I'm just using the pod decks again. I've got two cards that kind of are going to tie into this episode. The first one, I didn't think that I could make it a very long, complete episode, so I'm just going to touch on it, and then I'll go into the second one. But I'll get to that in a moment. What I want to do right now is I want to thank everybody for listening, as this is going to tie into the first card, the first pod deck card. This started as a hobby for me. I included Eric and then eventually Tim. And we've had a lot of fun together, and I was hoping that things could keep going, but unfortunately they're stepping away, so it's just going to be me. I'm going to continue the Facebook page and the email address for right now, so I would appreciate any feedback. You can go to our Upper One Podcast Facebook page. The email is on there, upperonepodcast@yahoo.com. Any feedback, any questions, anything you would like to know. If for those of you that haven't been to Alaska, please, if you're planning on coming up, I can give you ideas. I can tell you what you can do here. I'd like to hear from you. upper_one_podcast@yahoo.com. So let me get started. The first card that I pulled out was talk about why you started this podcast. And as I just said, I started this as a hobby. Kind of touched on it a minute ago, talking about the email address. When I included Eric, I got to looking. As of right now, both him and I on our friends page, I have 261 friends. Eric has 225 friends. Of those, 20 of them are mutual. So him and I share 20 of those friends. So we figured that we could get, if we could reach out to all the rest of those 200 and whatever friends that are on our list that have not ever been here, of those 200 people, we could give them ideas. Like I said, you want to come to Alaska because you've never been, hit us up. So that was part of the reason starting this podcast. But also, we wanted to have fun together. We've lived up here so long that we've done the majority of those activities together or at some point, on our own. So, whether it come to hunting, fishing, or going out with other people, doing those activities, camping, going to see some of the other sites in Alaska, that kind of stuff. So, that was what it was. Moving on to the second card. The second card is the top 10 moments on your podcast. Well, I kind of listened back to some of them. I don't have 10 moments. I kind of got right up to 20. First and foremost, and this is going to make it 21. As you can tell, for those of you that have listened, especially when Tim finally got onto the show, I think the top moments are just ribbing Eric and giving him and talking to him. Pardon my French. But overall, that's the number one thing is just, anytime something has happened, whether it be me or Tim, or even when we interviewed our friend Dan. Let me just go down this list on top of ribbing Eric, and there's a general repetitive theme in these 20 moments that kind of go back to the ribbing to Eric. So, in the first episode, when I started talking, as a host, you talk to your co-host, and I started talking on that episode. Eric didn't respond. And then he said, "Oh, wait, are you talking to me?" Because I didn't know I can't remember if he thought we were recording or not. He probably didn't. But, Eric was deep in thought on the first episode introduction when we first came in.
I was deep in some thought.
And these may not be, as the listeners, they may not be a top moment for you, but this was just something silly that I came across and I thought would be kind of a moment of our podcast. In the next episode, we had just started this podcast at the beginning of the pandemic, so we interviewed Eric's son, Chris, who at that time was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia in the Navy. And we questioned him about, what the protocol was that the military was doing to keep people safe during this pandemic. And, so Chris kind of filled us in on what his day was like when he'd go to work and how he was tested and, got the military to know that he was not sick or showing symptoms. Another one was the episode where I talked about, people posting stuff on Facebook, and one of the things was post 5 or 6 concerts that you've been to, one of them not being one. And Eric was confused because Eric knows me as, the 80s butt rocker is some of my favorite music. also country music. And the list that I had made out, he had no idea that I had never seen Kenny Rogers.
On a warm summer's evening, on a train bound for nowhere.
So he was confused, and I think he was trying to rib at me about who I've seen and who I haven't. I don't think that worked out for him. And of the people who guessed my post, our buddy Dan was the only one that was correct. Another one was when we were talking, and apparently we were talking something about people being crazy. And the next thing you know, you hear the door open, and Eric's wife Rhonda come in and said, "Did somebody say crazy?" Which at that point, it reminded me of back in the day with the Indianapolis Colts coach talking about playoffs.
Playoffs? Don't talk about playoffs. You kidding me? Playoffs?
So she came in and said, "Crazy? Did somebody say crazy?" That kind of turned into an interview with Rhonda, and the story behind that was Eric used to have a certain Buck Cherry song that I'm not going to say the name of the song.
Y'all crazy? No!
But Crazy was in that title. He used to have that as Rhonda's ringtone. That's kind of one of my moments, not necessarily tied in completely with the episode on the podcast. With her walking in and interrupting us is one of my fears that was going to happen all the time. The next episode was episode 4. One of my memorable moments from that episode was, when we first started talking. Being the wrestling fan that I am, kind of went in my Hulk Hogan mode.
And what you gonna do when Hulkamania and the largest arms in the world run wild on you?
And it just teed off Eric. Well, not teed him off, but it got him in the Macho Man mode.
Oh, yeah!
And he was actually doing rather good impersonating the Macho Man, and it kind of trickled down a little bit further into the episode, but that was a lot of fun. That actually leads me into the next episode where we actually got Tim on, and Tim told us some of his brush with fame moments, stories that did include Hulk Hogan and his wife at the time back then, when he lived in Florida before he moved to Alaska. That episode we brought Tim on was just listening to Eric introduce him as the genius of the family. So yeah, that was some of my other memorable moments. The next episode, our 7th episode, was when we first used these pod decks. I bought this set. There's 5 decks of cards. First one was an episode deck, so if you're having trouble finding content for your episode, you could just pull one of those cards out and talk about it. The other next 2 the first and second edition for the interview deck. And then there is the Would You Rather and the What the Heck deck. One of the interview cards, first one we pulled out was talk about your favorite famous dead person, and the 3 of us talked about, we couldn't put a number on who our favorite famous dead person is, but we talked a little bit about that. But one of the other questions, actually that was Tim's card. And this card was for Eric, and it said, talk about your recurring nightmare, meaning, if you have a nightmare or maybe not necessarily a nightmare, but a dream that recurs over and over again. And, of course we had Rhonda, and at that time we had Eric's sister Nia, which is Tim's wife, and they were sitting in there listening to us. So you could hear them in the background talking, and Eric, they kind of were talking about something along the lines about having to come home to his wife or something like that, and you could hear Nia a little bit more clearly in the background offering her opinion. So that was one of my memorable moments about that episode. Was, this was the 3 of our episode, and we have the Peanut Gallery in the background offering their opinions and their comments. Another one that came along maybe in the next episode was when Eric first introduced him. He said he's the genius of the family, and explained, that he plays a lot of those more technological mind use games, especially with his wife Rhonda, which I think one of them's Wordscapes, and maybe it's that Trivia Crack or stuff like that. Well, in this episode, Eric called Tim the dirt because, you can't keep dirt away. You can't ever vacuum it up and get it all cleaned up. But that led to the story of Eric squatting on Tim's boat. Another one for me that was kind of memorable was We started talking about using the smoker, cooking foods using the smoker up here because, one of Tim's big stable foods that he brings over for parties or Super Bowls and stuff like that is his bacon-wrapped jalapeno poppers that he smokes in his smoker, and they're phenomenal. So that kind of led to us talking about one of his coworkers back in Florida making a homemade smoker from some metal racks that he had picked up at a grocery store or somewhere had thrown out, and turns out that they were cooking so much stuff in that smoker that it was burning off the fat, and the fat got down onto the fire and caused a fire inside the smoker and caused the smoker to catch fire and burn down. That was pretty memorable as part of that episode. Another one was, during this pandemic, there were a couple of businesses that became victims and shut their doors. And fortunately, one of them, Mama O's, was able to reopen later. But business closure of the Last Frontier Bar brought us back to reminiscent memories where that conversation led to Eric forgetting that that's where he met his wife. Along with, we talked about a couple of firsts on that episode. That's the first place I ever two-stepped anywhere, and it was the first place that I had ever had my first legal beer with my dad. Not that I was drinking illegally with my dad, it was just after I had turned 21, my dad happened to be in town that next year for my brother's graduation, and that was the first place we went and had our first beer together after I was of legal drinking age. The next one, we started getting into this pandemic. The summer was coming around. We were going to start doing more summer stuff. So our podcast was going to be, we were going to try to do one every other week. And that led to us talking about more fishing. And we were talking about this and that and making up of new words, which I said fixery. I was trying to say the word fishery and whatever. And I don't know how fiction got in there, but I rolled right into it. And the making up of new words, fixery, is because the majority of fishing stories are fiction. They're made up. So that kind of worked out real good. That was a pretty good memory. On another episode, I don't know what was going on. I didn't listen to it all, but it got to the point where I think Eric just wasn't shut up and Tim was getting tired of it. And me sitting right here next to the podcast machine, I just started muting Eric. When you're muted and you have the headphones on, you can hear that your voice is not coming through the headphones when you're talking. So that kind of set Eric off. That was funny. Another thing too, and we talked about it, we got into talking about beer. Eric drinks Budweiser. I've been drinking more of the craft brewery, local brewery, which has kind of taken my palate for domestic beer. It's kind of ruined that for me. One of the things that I have done when I brought beer over to Eric's house is I've gone and gotten the 30-pack at Costco just because it's a lot cheaper buying 30 than it is going and buying even a 12-pack sometimes at a regular grocery store. So the bad thing about Costco is that beer's room temperature because it's just sitting there in the warehouse. And you bring that home to Eric's house like that, if it is not ice cold, Eric complains and bitches and moans about everything. On that episode, I said, and it's always one of my favorite quotes from a movie was from Desperado with Antonio Banderas. Well, Cheech Marin's in that, and somebody had walked in the bar, and I can't remember who it was. What kind of beer you got? And Cheech says,
all I got is piss warm chango.
So that's where that discussion went, was Eric doesn't like beer unless it's ice cold. I guess at one other point, I had been wearing my coveralls. I started buying not coveralls, overalls. I bought a couple of pair just because I was getting a little tired of wearing regular pants with the belt and the belt cutting into my belly when I'm sitting in my truck all day. So I bought some overalls. At one point during this episode, and like I said, I don't remember how it led up to it, but Eric said I looked like Junior Sample from Hee Haw because of my coveralls. So yeah, maybe I was looking like I was a little old-fashioned country boy or something. I don't know. The next one, Eric was telling the story about changing his light bulbs out on his headlights on his truck. He didn't know what it took to get into them because back in the day, the headlight assemblies, you just go in, take a couple bolts out, and that headlight assembly pops right out on most older vehicles. Well, nowadays, especially with him, he's got a 2012 Silverado, and I've got a 2015 Silverado, and What you have to do is take this cover off that's sitting up above the radiator. It's kind of tied into the grill, the radiator, and the engine compartment. So you got to take that off, and then you've got to pop off the grill before you can even move those headlight assemblies. So he was a little confused about knowing the difference between talking about something and a bitching about something on that episode. It led to a little bit of a lengthy discussion. So now he knows what it takes. Then this next episode we talked about, I had ordered us some bumper stickers. They had came in, so I was divvying up bumper stickers between the three of us and telling them that I had also ordered business cards for us. Had the email address on it with the podcast link and our names on it, and I thought it would look pretty cool. And then they, between Eric and Tim, they had said, yeah, now we're getting real professional. And I think I made the comment that I didn't want any of the peanut gallery's comments about what's professional, how our podcast is professional or not, because after all, this is a hobby for us. So the next memory for me is the big one so far. The biggest episode of my podcast was having Ben Carey and Brian Hopkins. Man, I love you guys for doing that for me. Elvis Monroe. I asked them for 10 minutes. They gave me 50 minutes, and I probably would have gotten more had they not been on the way out the door to go see Dennis Quaid. Anchorage, they're coming back up. This is May, and they're coming back up for the Backyard Barbecue the end of June this year with Sarah Evans, Easton Corbin, and Scotty McCreery, and Texas Hill, which, let me do this while I'm right here saying, Eric and I were talking, when we were talking about Craig Wayne Boyd being on American Idol, he was not. He was on The Voice, and I believe he was on Blake's team, which, matter of fact, talking about him, I did get to see him on Halloween this year. We had Coach Kern on as one of our guests this past Halloween. The wife and I actually dressed up as Alpha and Beta from The Walking Dead, and we went to Coots when Craig Wayne Boyd was there. So I did get to talk to him a little bit. He will be here with Texas Hill for the Backyard Barbecue. So yeah, anyways, back to that. Like I said, I probably would have got more, only asking for 10 minutes. I probably would have got more than what I got had they not been out on their way out the door to go see Dennis Quaid. Ben and Bryan, they're some of the easiest guys to talk to. They're really nice. Speaking of them, if you haven't heard already, they just finally recorded, not just a live song, but they recorded it and released it. It's out on all Spotify's and all that. I think it's even on iTunes, is their single One Day Someday that was co-written with Brett Young. So yeah, Ben and Bryan, man, I'm happy for you guys. Cannot thank you enough for doing that for me. That was my biggest episode so far. Been the most memorable besides Rib and Eric. Here's another one. Like I said, the theme to this is ribbing Eric and giving him a bunch. The next episode was me taking a stab at Eric for not being there to help me with the shed, and Tim keeps reminding him. Well, he knows I'm messing with him. I know the situation why he wasn't here. But after all the talk leading up to building this shed, he said, yeah, I'll be there. Well, part of that reason was, if you remember, we lost a family member, so there was the grieving time, and I understand. There were some other issues, and I could go into them, but I'm not. I just keep giving him about not being here. The reason why is because I'm expecting him to come over here and just talk about the way I built my shed, and he ain't got nothing to say, so that's why I keep giving it to him. With that being said, I got two more. That's all I got. We finally get to get Dan on for an interview, the voice of our intro, and my longtime friend. He's been a longtime radio personality, and he lets Eric have it because in the beginning, Eric says, good to see you. And he said, wait, did you just say good to see me? So Dan gave it back a little bit to him too. And then lastly, this is a pretty cool story because my latest episode was talking about taking my son to his first live wrestling show, even though it was not the WWE or AEW or Impact or any of those big names, shows that I have actually been to, but my son went to his first live show. They did have wrestlers there that have been on those big shows, but he had a blast. This is probably, of my podcast episodes, this is probably my second most memorable episode because of that. I had so much fun just watching him at that show, and I can't wait to take him to another one. But one of the things that stood out to me from this episode was during the intermission, a lot of the wrestlers had swag and other stuff, stickers and bracelets and all that out on the table for sale. And the one wrestler that was here that has been on that show, for those of you that do watch wrestling, his name is Zach Gowen. He lost his leg to cancer when he was 8 years old, but he's still wrestling. And when I walked up to him with my son, I explained to my son who he was and that he's been on those shows. And then and I asked him if there's anything he's got to say to my son growing up. He offered a lot of good information on not giving up, don't let obstacles stand you in the way. I thank Zach again on that episode and right now for that advice to my son. I hope that sticks with him. But the other cool thing about this is I have a friend that actually wrestled in that show. He's one of our Alaska Aces alumni cowbell crew. I'm not going to tell you his real name, but he goes by the name of Bryson Axel. That's his wrestling name. Well, he just messaged me the other day and he told me he just listened to that episode. He thanked me for plugging the wrestling show and he told me that he was going to pass this episode, that wrestling episode, on to Zach so Zach can hear it. So maybe there might be some future get-togethers with Zach should he come back or should I be able to see him again. So yeah, that was really cool. With that being said, I plugged it earlier. I want to plug it again. I want to thank you all for listening, as this is just my hobby and it's down to just me. I still have the Facebook page, Upper One Podcast, and the email address, upper_one_podcast@yahoo.com. So thank you all so much again, and I hope to see you soon.
Hold on, did he just say, I'm glad to see you?
As I am going to be getting ready here in the next couple hours after I finish this episode. Another friend of mine, the great, the one and only horseman, Bobby Hill. Today is his birthday, so I have to go into town and go have some dinner and celebrate with him. So that's what I will be doing, and I will keep y'all posted as to, hopefully with my fingers crossed, upcoming events on the podcast. Like I said, I got both fingers crossed that there's going to hopefully be another big name. This will be the biggest interview of the podcast so far, the end of July, if I can work it out. I'm hoping that Coach Kern can help me out with that. So stay tuned, keep listening. Thanks again from halfway up the Eagle River Valley, not as far up as the other podcast I listen to. This is Scott. Thanks again. We'll see you later.
Hold on, did he just say, I'm glad to see you?
No, we'll talk to you later.